Good evening, everyone. My name is Rachel Spence, and I am with the Cobra Public Library. And this evening, we have a wonderful interview between the history guy, Dan Buchanan, and Keith Ross Leckie, who wrote Cursed Blood of the Donnellys, which is a fantastic book that he will be talking to Dan about this evening. So I will pass it over to you, Dan, and I will be going on mute. Enjoy your conversation.
Thank you very much. Hello. And Keith, congratulations on the book, Cursed Blood of Donnellys. It's an interesting read. Found it lots of fun. Could you tell us, this is a story that's well known in Canadian history. It's been treated numerous ways in books and theater. Why did you pick this time and to present it in this way? What was your objective in doing that?
Well, it's true that it has been, the story has been told many ways, and as you say, in several books, both fiction and nonfiction, fictionalization. The Kelly books in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, the Rainey plays in 72, there was a trilogy of plays on the Donnellys. There were a couple of musical albums, folk music about the Donnellys. And there's a musical now, Vengeance, that is doing the rounds, has been playing for a couple of years in London and Edmonton, and it's a musical about the Donnellys. I felt, though, that the Donnelly story is epic, and there's a lot of elements to it that have not been explored, details about the characters and the way the Donnellys have been represented. It's been interesting. Over the years, the Donnellys have either been seen as innocent lambs that were slaughtered by this gang, massacred in 1880, or they're seen as monsters that deserved it. And that's a really interesting exploration, because the musical, the recent musical, is seeing Joanna Donnelly and the Donnellys as these murderous villains. And I think that's kind of an old-fashioned way of looking at them. And I've known the story since I was a kid. My father grew up on a farm west of London. And I remember once when I was 10 or 11 driving through the town of Lucan with my dad, coming home from the homestead to Toronto. And we stopped off in Lucan, and he said, there's really interesting things that went on here with the Donnies. So we go into a general store, and there's a guy behind the store, behind the counter. And my dad says, so this is Lucan. What can you tell us about the Donnellys? And the guy behind the counter went, here, we don't talk about the Donnellys. And I remember that clearly, the animosity, the almost hostility to outsiders coming and asking about the Donnellys. So when I was that young, and the story has always resonated with me. It's a big epic story with lots of characters, and there's violence and there's sex, and it's a great story that deserves a contemporary telling, because there has not been a rendition in book form done for decades that really tells the story. So I felt that we have to humanize them, basically, the Donnellys. I felt it was important that the Donnellys deserve to be seen with all of their warts and their attributes. I mean, they at the time it was said that the best friend you could ever have was a Donnelly, and the worst enemy. And that, I think, was true. They were rascals, and the boys, the 7 brothers that Jim and Joanna had, and the one daughter, Jenny, poor Jenny, the youngest, who was lovelorn because the local boys would not go near her because she had these 7 older brothers. But they were a very attractive bunch of rascals. They had money. They were relatively prosperous. They dressed well. They had waistcoats and watch, pocket watches. They had black boots, most of them. They loved their high black boots, and they were great horsemen. They were great dancers, very adept fighters. They were fist and club men. They didn't believe in guns, which is interesting. And once or twice when they were involved with guns, they totally missed. They couldn't aim a gun worth a damn. But they were just an interesting, colorful lot. And why I wanted to write a contemporary version, because they weren't innocent. They burned a few barns and seduced a few women. They were not monsters, because there are a lot of letters that I've read and research I've done that showed they were quite compassionate. And Joanna helped out in the community. They donated some of their land to build a school that ran, the Donnelly Schoolhouse, that ran for 12 years. And the teachers would come. There were 4 teachers, 3 women and 1 man, and they always stayed with the Donnellys. And there are letters from them and versions of what it was like to live with the Donnellys. And all 4 of them talked about how compassionate, how warm and welcoming they were. They were given the best beds. They were given clothing in the winter. They were fed very well. And Joanna was always portrayed as a warm host. So that's the other aspect of the Donnellys that I really felt needed to be explored. After many years, after having that childhood experience of hostility when asking questions about the Donnellys in Lucan, I really wanted to explore that. And most of my work has been, in the last 40 years, has been in script writing, in television and film. And I've tried to do the Donnelly series or even as a mini series a couple of times, and it almost has happened, and then it didn't happen. And so finally I just decided to write it as a novel. Later in my career now, I'm getting into novel writing, very much enjoying it. It's quite a difference between script writing, where you get totally beaten up by producers and directors and actors, and you really have to be thick-skinned and hard-nosed to maintain your vision. But in novel writing, the editor is extremely respectful, and you can control your material so well. So I've really enjoyed in the last 10 years writing novels, and so I felt that the Donnellys deserved another shot in a novel. As I say, there's been quite a few written over the years, but for a contemporary audience and perhaps a more complex look at who the Donnellys were. So.
Okay, no, that's great. Now you've touched on some of the kind of themes that people can experience through the book. Can you kind of list those out and illustrate them a little bit?
Themes. Well, the idea that one of the myths about the Donnellys I found was that it was Protestants and Catholics, and it was essentially, but the gang of vigilantes that marched on the Donnellys on February 3rd, 1880, were fellow Catholics from the St. Patrick's Church, but they were fundamentalists. And the difference, the problem, the conflict that the church had with the Donnellys was that the Donnellys would do business with Protestants. Joanna and Jim believed that they were horse traders. They did very well they had a stagecoach business. They traded horses, they studded horses, they had a cattle operation, but they did business with Protestants, and that really gave them prosperity, except that the fundamentalist Catholics in the area hated that, including the priest, Father John Connolly. And I'm amazed when you go over some of the notes on John Connolly's sermons. Some of them were directed directly against the Donnellys, saying balls of fire will fall on their heads if they don't, if their behavior doesn't change. And the behavior he was talking about was doing business with Protestants. So my point with the Donnellys, most people believe it was Protestants and Catholics, but actually it was Catholics against Catholics. It was a Catholic bunch of vigilantes, somewhat spurred on by Father John Connolly, that marched on the Donnelly homesteads, the 2, and killed everybody they could.
That's interesting. That kind of deals with the conventional wisdom about the story. That's interesting. How about this is a novel, and it's based on a historical set of events. And I'm always interested in how kind of where does the history end and the novel start? And how do you deal with constructing a story with that? Could you address that a little bit?
Well, I have done some journalism work early in my career, and I love that, as a matter of fact, to a point, except that in journalism, you have to tell the absolute truth. You're somewhat confined. And I believe in my approach to the Donnellys, and in fact, all my work, because I did the Halifax explosion, or the miniseries, The Avro Arrow. And I really do have a line of truth that I don't want to cross. But I believe that you can embellish the truth and make it more dramatically appealing. And that's what I've done with the Donnellys. Even though the essential facts are true, there have been a few changes. I do have in terms of dealing with historic subjects and people and events, there is the adage that, you can rearrange facts a little bit to make it dramatically more effective, but as long as you tell the truth. And I think I've tried to be good at that over my career. I do have a tattoo on my arm, which is it's a quote by Mark Twain. It says, "Everything here is absolutely true, except what isn't, and it should have been." So I kind of use that as a guideline. And you, as historian, maybe I've crossed the line on a few things. Let me give you an example. With the Donnellys, there's Joanna McGee and Jim Donnelly in their youth in Tipperary, Boris O'Kane, Tipperary. All of that is true, except that Joanna actually was not the daughter of the estate owner. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper in Boris O'Kane, well-to-do shopkeeper who was close friends with the manager of the estate. And so when Jim Donnelly started pressing his interest with Joanna, her father asked the estate manager if she could stay in the estate, in the big house, and she did for a year. And Jim, there are stories of them having their meetings and subterfuge and so on. But so the truth was that she was not the daughter of the estate owner, but she was his close friend. She was the daughter of his close friend. So that was, I just wanted to simplify it. I wanted to raise the Romeo and Juliet concept of, two families, and also the Jim being the poor tenant farmer, which he was, and Joanna being from a more affluent family. And I just, made that change. So that's one example of how I change things. So I do try to tell the truth of the story. What else? Well, anyway, do you have any other?
No, that's good. The thing is, it works,
I think so.
and it makes the story kind of more compelling. So that's great. I have a couple of old saws here that I'm going to rhyme off, and I'd ask you to see if they apply, if the concept behind them applies to the story somewhere, and how and where. And the first one is, you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy.
Well, I think that's true. Although Jim and Joanna tried to be a little more progressive when they got to Canada, and they do talk about that, not bringing along all the feuds and the anger and the religious strife, but trying to forge a new life in a new land. And I think that theme comes out. But the idea of violence, and I think Jim's fatal flaw was that he his curse, if you will, was that he resorted to violence when all else seemed to fail. And as I say, his tragic flaw, if that was apparent in Ireland, and the big turning point in the novel, or in the sort of the center of the novel, is when Pat Farrell comes back to claim the land, and it turns into a huge feud that turns into a killing, and Jim Donnelly on the lam for a year. All of that is true. That when he was wanted for murder, he was out in his fields in Joanna's dress, so that they would think, people passing by would think it was her. And the constables tried to catch him many times. But anyway, the Pat Farrell issue and the violence that led to the killing was part of his fatal flaw, and that continued on, so that when he comes back from Kingston, he is the toxin, if you will, that really jeopardizes and then confirms the massacre in his of his family. It's his violent tendency, and his tragic flaw.
Mm-hmm. And related to the Farrell thing, one other saying here is, if a deal looks too good to be true, it probably is. And that, to me, applies to that land deal.
Yes, if you take the fatalistic nature of events, if he had just bought a damn piece of land and got a mortgage and paid it off, the Pat Farrell issue would not have happened. Or if yes, making the choice to squat, which was not a disrespectful thing. It was not. It was considered a legitimate way of acquiring land, except you had the risk that you could lose the whole thing.
Yeah, and it was actually quite common at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, you mean the squatting?
Yes, that 7-year thing, because lots of people just disappeared and never came back for their land.
Correct, and the local people would like those lots to, if there's 100 acres of land sitting there, they would rather see someone developing it and creating part of the commerce of the community and being part of the church. And so the Donnellys were fairly well received as squatters, but so that was okay. And or then the judgment, which is accurately portrayed, where Pat Farrell was given 50 acres and Jim Donnelly was given 50 acres with the farm and most of the cleared land. That was pretty generous and fair offer, I felt. But again, Jim's fatal flaw, and the fact that Pat Farrell was a violent man and wanted, was into vengeance and violence and confrontation. I mean, that was the toxic brew that led to the big battle, and then led to the fate of the Donnellys. I believe that was really those events were the seeds of the massacre.
I just recall reading that part where Jim and Joanna were discussing whether to take this deal.
Yeah.
And I was putting the book down and I said, Jim, listen to your wife.
Exactly. Don't do it.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Oh, there's another one that we all know of, and that is like father, like son.
Right. Well, yes, the truth is that there's not a lot of information on Jim's father, just a line here or there. So I did kind of embellish the character, but I felt in a reasonable, honest way that, and I wanted him to represent the Irish, that the English, the British, were really brutal, considering that Ireland was so close to them and that they were not unlike physically, and the British were very brutal with the Irish, and I wanted that to come out, and I wanted the bitterness of the Cromwell invasion, where they took over all the lands. And I mean, all of that is true, that the Irish were occupied, brutally occupied, thousands of them killed, imprisoned, enslaved. Something I found in my history that you might know about or be interested in is there were tens of thousands of Irish slaves that went to the Caribbean that were taken by the British in the early 1600s as slaves. And they were taken to work the plantations. Unfortunately, they were not very good because they would die in the heat and the hard work. Their bodies were just not very good. But I've come over across documents in that time period in the 1830s, 1820s and 30s, where there were Irish that were actually slaves, owned slaves, that, and they were considered worth £8, and black slaves that were then starting to come out of the coast of Africa, the West Coast, they were considered worth £20, as they would last longer and were stronger and so on. So the idea, Matthew Donnelly represents the oppressed Irish and the sometimes irrational anger, maybe not irrational, but they, the grounding is from the British invasion and from how they were treated and how their land was taken. They were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to own a weapon or a horse, a firearm or a horse. So Matthew's rage is grounded in that history, and it's a fire keg waiting to explode, and it does with the pony sequence.
Yes, and the remnants of that came here.
Yes, yeah. It's interesting that in the 1830s and 1840s, Tipperary, Ireland was the most violent county in Ireland, and by 1850, 1860, in the 50s and 60s, Borris-O'Kane County, where the Donnellys lived and where Lucan is in the middle, that was the most violent county in Canada. It was peopled by Irish, the Irish from Tipperary, and of course the English had been there beforehand, and so it was a bit of a fire keg, very violent. It's important to note that when the Donnellys got there, it was already violent. Rather Borris-O'Kane and the Lucan area. There were arsons often. Lucan had 7 bars. 3 of them were Protestant, 3 were Catholic, and 1 was a mix. And every Saturday night outside I think it was the Central Hotel was where both Protestants and Catholics could go. There was always several fights going on in the street. So before the Donnellys arrived, it was a violent area. And after they were massacred, and after Will Donnelly finally moved out, there were no Donnellys left. There were still lots of reports of fights, arson, and thievery, and the Donnellys were not that big an influence, even though they became notorious.
One other, and this, I think about this when I get the picture of all the family together in the later parts of the book, all dressed to the nines going out to their events. And that is, you can dress them up, but you can't take them anywhere.
Well, they were considered an asset in most, for most parties or weddings. Weddings at the time were big social functions. And it's not like you had to be invited. If there's a wedding going on, you just went. But you had to take, the Donnellys were known for taking gifts. They went to the Kennedy wedding. I'm sorry, not the Kennedy, nuts. I'm getting the names mixed up. But there is Maggie Thompson, the Thompson wedding. They did actually go in and disrupted in the middle of it. There was Maggie Thompson that Will Donnelly was totally in love with and wrote poetry to, and so they did go to they did disturb the wedding. He stood up and he objected, but the wedding went on. And then they went to the they went to the reception that night, and they brought lots of gifts. All of that is true. So Will Donnelly went to the wedding of his beloved to a local farmer because the Thompsons hated the Donnellys, and so there's a lot of good stuff there. But yeah, so the Donnelly boys would come in mass, and they were very intimidating, but they were also good partiers, and so the girls were attracted, and their friends were supportive of them. Anyway, it's a interesting environment.
One thing I was curious about, in my own family, I have a murder back there in that time period, and the family connected to it basically cleared out of the area, except for one person who I'm descended from. And so I'm wondering about in the Lucan area, you've touched on it a bit, but what is the legacy of all of this with the Donnellys in Lucan? You've talked about talking to the folks, they don't want to talk about it.
Well, things have changed. It's quite interesting in that for so many years, there was this dark cloud over Lucan. And I've talked to 3 of the local council members. I did a reading in the public library on the main street of Lucan. And you're kind of wondering if someone's going to confront you. And the council members came up to me and said, we like your book. We like what you've done with the book. You've humanized the Donnellys. And we, in the last few years here in Lucan, have decided the Donnellys could be an asset. It happened so long ago that we should just embrace the story. It's a big, epic, terrible story, but interesting. And the Donnelly Museum on the main street of Lucan is wonderfully curated and organized. They've got really interesting things. Big family tree of the Donnellys on one wall, and you can go there. It's the Lucan Heritage Center and Donnelly Museum, and they have artifacts from the Donnellys. And so the council has started to embrace this. So I went to the public library a little worried about their attitude, and after I did a reading and answered a few questions, there were 4 couples that came up, older couples, and they wanted their books signed, and I was happy to do that. And they said, "We think you did a good job on the book." And I'm saying, "Who should I sign this to?" And the 4 couples were the Kennedys, the Flanagans, the Ryders, and the McLaughlins. So these are all the kids, the great-great-grandchildren of the vigilantes. And so I was pleased that their attitude had changed. And then after the reading, everybody went across the road to the roadhouse. There's a roadhouse. And they have, I don't have an example, but they have Donnelly's beer.
Okay.
Donnelly's beer. And they're the little saying on the cans are "Trouble's Brewing." And
perfect.
So, go to the roadhouse with, there are a couple of vigilantes those families that came over, and we had Donnelly's beer and Joanna's fine roasted chicken and Jim's favorite fish and chips. So they're, the community is kind of embracing the Donnellys, and I think they're open for a wider interpretation of what the story means. And I think that's a very, very healthy thing. Because, just to go back, to continue that, I think what happened when the Donnellys were killed, when the massacre occurred, there was a huge outpouring publicly. It was a huge event that journalists poured into Lucan from the States and from Canada and from Britain. There were people that came over, and for months, going into the murder trial of the 6 vigilantes, there were 6 that were charged with the murder. And this was only the beginning. If these 6 had been convicted, prosecution was preparing charges for 14 more people. And these were prominent heads of households. These were prominent members of the St. Patrick's Church congregation, the Peace Society, as it was called. And so at first there was sympathy for the Donnellys, but as the trial moved on, the sympathy was pouring for the 6 men who were going to hang. The idea in this small town of 6 prominent household members being hanged would have devastated the community. So that sympathies turned toward them. And I think what the town had to do, there were witnesses that came out and swore that these vigilantes, where the evidence had been strong against them, that they were 20 miles away birthing a calf, or they were working on a construction site 30 miles away in London, or, you know, the witnesses came out and swore to this, and they were lying through their teeth. But they had actually, I believe the church had given them the, you know, the forgiveness to do that they could do it. In any case, the town, to survive, had to turn against the Donnellys. And I believe that's continued. When you get the rendition of Joanna Donnelly with her fist in the air telling her sons that they have to go out and kill at least one man or they won't be men, you know, that kind of legendary bull is not accurate. I think the town very systematically needed to survive, needed to portray the Donnellys as monsters. And I think that was wrong.
Fascinating.
I'm just going to jump in here really quickly. Our time is running up. It's about 2 minutes and 30 seconds, so I just wanted to let you guys know that. And feel free to take over and to tie it up at this point.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Rachel.
Keith, any final comments?
No, I might say that I'm, you know, I've been living with the Donnellys. It takes a few years to write a book like this. Just when I thought I was done, I've been hired to write scripts for a series for Discovery CTV. A friend there, the executive producer, Edwina Follows, was a Donnelly fan, and she optioned the novel before it was even published. And so we've been working our way through. So every morning I get up and when I had finished the novel, I'm going, oh, thank God, I'm finished with the Donnellys. And now I still wake up every morning and I'm facing 4 one-hour scripts. They're looking at a yearly amount of 8 one-hour scripts, and they're looking at 3 seasons. So it's very exciting. It has not been green lit yet, and COVID has set the whole thing back. But I'm still up to my ears in in the Donnelly story, and you know, it evolves. It, as you work with it, you find new aspects of it that are interesting and stimulating. And I'm, you know, the truth is, I'm still not tired of that. Those damn rascals. They're really interesting to write about.
It's a great story.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to do this and for, you know, letting more people know about the amazing story that we have that started in Ontario, and really has affected so many people's lives in different ways. And I appreciate both of you so much for being here. And yeah, if anyone's interested in purchasing this book or picking it up at the library, you can reach out to us and let us know, and we will help you out there.